Just rolled in. This is Mike Mazaris with AST Environmental, and I'm here to introduce our speaker for today, our guest speaker from Vertex Environmental, Kevin French. He's a vice president with Vertex, and I've worked with Kevin for many years and actually was involved with this project somewhat, and excited to hear about it. Kevin, I'm going to mute myself and hand it off to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Mike. Welcome, everyone, this afternoon or this morning if you're on the West Coast. As Mike said, I'm Kevin French from Vertex Environmental. This talk, it's a little bit different. It's a case study, but the focus is slightly different. Instead of focusing primarily on sort of contaminant conditions and treatment technologies and things like that, I will cover that. However, the focus is really to shed some light on what the owner's perspective was of this whole process, which we don't often hear from. And it's a little bit of a more interesting take on things, I think. So we'll jump right into it. So clearly, as it says here, this talk is called A Significant Return on Investment Achieved by Successfully Remediating a Challenging Chlorinated Solvent Site. So I'll talk a little bit about Vertex and myself, and then I've broken down the site remediation activities into periods, sort of before, this was before Vertex got involved, during, obviously when we were doing our work at the site, afterwards, which is the follow-up remediation, verification, monitoring, and then what's happening with the site today. And then I'll talk about what the actual return on investment was. And as Mike said, we'll have time for Q&A at the end here. I'll just point out this picture here. This was midday out of the site. This was a few years ago, and there was a lot of wildfires in the area. So this is all smoke that was in the air when we were doing our work, in case you're wondering. So Vertex Environmental Inc., we're a specialized remediation contracting firm located in Ontario, Canada. This is our 20th anniversary this year, and we do work coast to coast across Canada. This is me, Kevin French. As Bruce said, Mike said, I'm vice president. I'm an environmental engineer background, and I've been doing this for 35 years now, so I've been around for quite a while. Mostly on the consulting side, but the past 10 or 11 years on the contracting side. And just a little bit of a plug for Vertex. These are the services that we offer. And today we're talking specifically about in situ remediation. So we'll jump right into the talk now. So this was what was happening at the site before Vertex got involved. So this is pre-2018. This was my very first visit to the site. I'll show you some more photos later, but basically it was the corner of a commercial plaza, no buildings at the time, and just used basically as a snow dump, as you can see here. But more on the background, it's an active shopping center in lower mainland BC, so just north of Seattle. As was typical, there was an on-the-premise dry cleaning operation present in one of the units for about 25 years. Importantly, surrounding the property, again, as is common, there's a mix of commercial, but there's also residential and a school right across the road. And there's some surface water bodies nearby as well. Various consultants had been studying this site since, coincidentally, 1988, when I started my career. I didn't work on this site. And they had done a lot of work up to this point. So they demolished part of the building. They had done a remedial excavation. You can see here about 6,000 cubic meters of soil that was impacted with tetrachloroethylene was removed. They also installed a perimeter groundwater pump and treat system to try to not completely hydraulically control the plume, but to prevent further migration of the plume off-site through a lower sand unit. Here's a site plan of the property. That red dashed line was the limits of the plume that were exceeding the local regulatory standards. And we had exceedances out here of both soil and groundwater concentrations, as well as soil vapor concentrations. The little blue box there was the former dry cleaning unit. And then you can see a slightly larger dashed line around it. That was the remedial excavation that took place. So it extended actually partway out into the roadway to the north of the site. Stratigraphy wise, again, this purple zone was the remedial excavation. but the site had about 10 meters or say 30 odd feet of a very dense glacial till, contained cobbles. It was so dense actually that you couldn't drive a geoprobe point through it. Beneath that, which is about the level of the water table, that you got into a sand unit that was very thick, so 30 meters or about 100 feet or more deep. And because of the hydrostatic pressure, once you started to get down a ways into that sand, you had heaving sands or flowing sands occurring. So that was challenging. And then very, very deep, you got into more of a confining layer. So most of the contamination was present in that sand unit. And the main plume, the impacts were between 11 and 21 meters. So I'm going to guess, sorry, I'm Canadian, 35 to maybe 70 feet below grade. Timeline wise, 90s and 2000s, as I mentioned, there was some excavation that took place. The groundwater treatment system went in 2015. Now, the client's objective, the owner of the property, was to reduce these tetrachloroethylene concentrations at the site. Because of the levels that were there, which were indicative of potentially mobile DNAPL, it was classified by the regulator as a high-risk site. That puts significant restrictions on the property. Basically, you can't do anything with it. You can't finance it, you can't redevelop it or rezone it. There's so many things you can't do with the site. It's a significant detriment. They also wanted, so that was their primary consideration. They also wanted to shut down that perimeter pump and treat system, which was obviously an ongoing operation and maintenance cost. And then ideally what they wanted to do was undertake a human health and ecological risk assessment for the site to get what's called in British Columbia, a certificate of compliance. So basically a regulatory sign off that the site is suitable for its intended use. I mentioned the site was high risk because of the potential presence of NAPL. When the consultant and the owner were looking at remedial options, they estimated, the standard approach or a approach could be a straight dig and dump. But because of the depth, the dewatering, the shoring that was required, it was going to be in the tens of millions of dollars. The one number I heard was upwards of $50 million to go that route. So obviously that's a non-starter. They were going to have to run that pump and treat system forever, as I said. They were also going to have to monitor soil vapor in the existing on-site building and the off-site properties because of the concentrations. And also because it was moving off-site, they had potential third-party liability issues associated with that. The client's perspective, therefore, they're sitting there with this property. They had no exit plan in sight for this. They couldn't sell it. They couldn't finance it. Like I said, they couldn't do anything with it. So this was a real stigma on their portfolio. And then they also realized that if they could sell the site, it would have been at a loss, but they would have had some trailing liability because of the off-site issues. So this was not an ideal situation, clearly. Now, the next period this is when Vertex got involved with the consultant. The first thing we did is we proposed to do a pilot scale injection of BOS 100 in one of the hotspot areas of the site to see the effectiveness of this approach in remediating subsurface conditions. A little bit of background on trap and treat BOS 100 in case you're not familiar with it. It's a commingled particle-based remedial amendment that combines activated carbon absorption and chemical reduction. So it's been around for a long time, 20 years now in the US, about 8 in Canada. It can be used for plumes or PRB application, different ways to get it in the ground. In this case, we were injecting. The nice thing about it is what we've found is usually if it's designed properly, you're looking at a single application and it provides a long-term solution. Because it's a long-lasting particle, it prevents rebound, so it has back diffusion control. So it's really excellent engineered product. Now, the pilot scale itself took place in June 2019. The consultant, SLR in this case, selected a hotspot on site. I'll talk about that a little bit later. We didn't know at the time the hotspot was actually the worst possible case location on the property. That was the site that was triggering the high risk designation. We were just said, hey, let's do the pilot in this area, and we designed it. So what we did is we advanced 6 temporary injection points surrounding that location. We injected a 12% slurry of BOS 100, and then afterwards we collected some confirmatory boreholes, soil samples from those for inspection for remedial amendment presence. And based on that, we saw some really good distribution across the targeted depth zone. Now, the consultant obviously then went out, did some post-injection monitoring. This is a summary of the results for that location. The ones that are highlighted in red were above that high risk designation of 20,600. So we completed our pilot scale injections, and then you can see, fairly shortly afterwards, concentrations are starting to go down. About 3 months later, it gets to the point where, we're about 58% reduction. So more than half reduction in the concentrations over a fairly short period of time. Based on this, the consultant and the owner decided that the technology was proven, it would work at the site, we could apply it at the site, and they decided to proceed with full scale. So here we are, 2019, 2021, because there was about a year's worth of monitoring eventually before we got around to doing the full scale injection. So 2021, the injection program took place in both on and off-site locations at the property. Here's a layout of the site. You can see a much higher density grid across the property itself. Those are the closely spaced red points in the green box and the yellow box. And then off-site, it was a looser spacing, fairly widely spaced and lower density. And the intent was not to remediate off-site. It was just to apply some remedial amendment to improve conditions generally over time. And on-site as well, just to remind you, the goal was not to actually completely remediate the site. It was to reduce concentrations to the point that they could delist it as a high-risk site and facilitate a risk assessment. So the work that was done, you can see here 105 points on site on a 10-foot grid, fairly deep interval over about 35 feet vertically, 21,000 kilograms of BOS 100, and then off-site, only about 16 points, wider spacing, as I said, and a smaller loading rate. In total, it was about 68 days work on site. Now, the approach we used is called geotap. Because of that dense till, if you recall, I mentioned at the beginning, we couldn't drive a direct push point. So instead, we pre-drilled points down to the bottom of the target interval, backfilled them with a bentonite mixture, and then we could go back and advance a geoprobe point and inject it into the formation under pressure. So this was one of the first sites we've tried this at in Canada, and it worked very well. Otherwise, we would not have been able to do what we did at this site because, like I said, we couldn't drive a direct push point. BOS 100 is a particulate, so you can't inject it through monitoring wells or injection wells. And obviously it was too deep to soil mix. So really this was our only option, and it worked out excellently. Now a few photos of the things in action. So here's just a shot of the sonic rig and the hydrovac doing the pre-drill holes. And then we come back with a geoprobe rig. That's our mixing and injection trailer in the background for the BOS 100. And then this is an aerial view of the work area. You can see we had the whole thing cordoned off, and if you look closer, you can see some light gray patches in the grid across that. Those are those previously completed injection points where we backfilled with bentonite. And out in the roadway there, where we had some additional points, you can see the back truck at work for the clearance. Now, everything didn't go smoothly. There's not many sites where everything goes 100% as planned, and this site was no exception. There was some challenges, but we did come up with some solutions, and I'll highlight those briefly. So in some cases, even though we pre-drilled boreholes and backfilled them, we still had refusal of the direct push tooling. And that was primarily because we saw in some areas that the cobbles and boulders were actually so big they would still tumble into the pre-drill hole and block it. So we ended up increasing the diameter of those holes and backfilling them with a thicker solution of bentonite. We also had some issues with tooling or the rods getting clogged. In some cases, we had lost rods. So initially we'd just pull things, and this was primarily not so much due to the bentonite. This was due to some of the sands also coming up into the injection tips. So we would pull them, clean them out, reattempt. The best approach we found was to actually inject a stream of water as we were advancing the tooling to keep those injection ports open so that they didn't get clogged. But in some cases, we still had issues, and we had to cut and run, and we lost some tooling at the site. In addition, we're injecting 100,000 gallons of solution at the site, a pretty large volume. So we were seeing some daylighting issues. Primarily, it was coming up through some pre-drilled location or previously improperly abandoned boreholes. In that case, we did adjust our backfill mixture to make it thicker to support or withstand the pressures of our injection better. We also played around with increasing the concentration of slurry at some points to make it a bit thicker so it wasn't as fluid. We increased injection pressures in certain locations so that it would jet out at a higher exit velocity into the formation and not risk maybe short circuiting up nearby boreholes or up the pre-drilled hole. And if all else failed, in some cases we had to reallocate mass to adjacent injection points to get the targeted loading rate in the subsurface. So to summarize, again, this is sort of the client's position during all this work that was taking place over a few months on site. At the end of the pilot scale injection, just that one little piece of work at the site allowed them to delist the site as a high risk property. And that was, as I mentioned, that was their most important objective. So little did we know there was a lot riding on that pilot working, a lot. And fortunately it was successful. And after that, we had proof of concept, we went to full scale. The client told us after the fact that if they had not been able to possibly increase the zoning on the site, like, go to a higher, better use, if they were only stuck with maybe continued commercial use, they would not have spent the money to clean up the site. So the fact that they had an option of upzoning or the potential for that made the decision to spend the money to remediate the site easier. And then the other thing they said to us was, and people who do in situ know this, it's much less disruptive, especially if you consider compared to an excavation approach. So there was continued access and operation of the shopping center. There was no tenants displaced. And this was most important for the client as well. There was no loss of income from this property during remediation. There were no requests for rent relief. And if you remember, this is during COVID. So there was a lot of issues with commercial properties and tenants defaulting on rents and things like that. But because of the way that this work was completed, the owners did not face any of those secondary or issues that might otherwise have taken place with the remediation. So once the remediation is done, the follow-up monitoring continues with the consultant. So just to highlight, this was the area where we did the pilot scale injection. And because this was the worst case area and the one that was driving the high risk, I'm focusing on that for the results. But basically, here's where we were after about 3 months when they decided to go with full scale. They continued monitoring, we did our full scale, and then here's where we are at the end of their monitoring. And there was no expectation, as I said, to meet a remedial standard, but in fact we did on this site and ended up with over a 99.9% reduction, which is pretty incredible. Just to show it graphically, here's the concentrations of PERC at that location over time to the point where we are, basically not non-detect, but well below remedial standards. So a huge success. And then there was site restoration that took place. Obviously, we kind of tore up the area quite a bit with all of our equipment and drilling. So that was replanted, and a similar work took place across the road at the residential property. And afterwards, again, just to focus on the client's position afterwards. So, you know, after this work was done and they had their post-remediation groundwater monitoring events completed, they proved that they could shut off that perimeter groundwater treatment system. You know, they had 5 quarters of demonstrated stable decreasing plumes, so they cut off that long-term O&M cost. Now that they got rid of that high-risk designation and the standards were, or the concentrations were much lower on the site, they could apply for rezoning changes and potential redevelopment of that property. So here we are today. This is 2023. This was earlier this year. I was out back in BC in May, and the site looking not bad. It's greening up, but it looks like just a little piece of parkland on the property. The consultant applied for their certificate of appliance in August. Because this was no longer considered a high-risk site, the approval process was much simpler. So there was no ministerial or regulatory review required. It was basically you know, certifying the conditions of the property and submitting it for approval and registration. The owner of the property then is going to apply for zoning change, and then they said probably market the property for sale. So they said the highest and best use for this property, considering its urban location, will be to densify the site. So a mixed commercial, probably multifamily residential, like condos above. This remediation program at the site is a huge internal success story for the owner. They have a fairly large real estate portfolio, and this is not the only site that they have impacts, which is, you know, pretty common with these commercial properties. But this was by far their worst property and a huge success for them internally. One of the vice presidents there told me that 10 years ago, they had no exit plan. They would have never thought they could get out of this property without significant losses and trailing liability. But now that the site is in its current environmental condition, it's marketable and it's worth market value. So that's very important for them. So to talk about their return on investment side, because that was the whole focus of this case study, what was their investment, the client? So basically they had trust in the process, the consultant and the contractor, that we had a viable solution for the property. It took about 4 years, start to finish, you know, from initial planning stages through to the pilot, through to the full scale and the post remediation monitoring, plus the risk assessment, and it cost several $1 million. I can't disclose exactly how much, but it was several $1 million, as you can imagine. And their return on investment, basically, you know, it's a little cheesy, but their trust was rewarded. And I was told they're in the process of completing an evaluation of the property, but they said the increased value of the property is worth at least 2 to 3 times the cost of the entire program. So the remediation, the monitoring, the risk assessment, and everything paid for itself 2 to 3 times over. So it's not a story you hear often about site remediation. You know, usually you hear about it as just a cost, but in this case, it had value, significant value to the property. And that is all that I have for you today. So I'm happy to take questions, and I thank you for listening to this talk.
Thanks, Kevin. So we've got a few questions that have come in, and we'll go ahead and start addressing those. Again, I did notice that some folks did join late, and so if you missed it, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available if you'd like to catch something that you missed. But Kevin, we'll go ahead and dive in. We have a couple questions already. So the first is, would desorption from BOSS 100 be a concern with potential rebound? And there's a second question from the same person that is related, is how is rebound prevented?
Okay, yeah, that's an excellent question. So It is prevented. That's one of the whole design features of the product. So I mentioned earlier in the talk that it's a combination of activated carbon and elemental iron. So it's actually iron impregnated activated carbon. And the treatment mechanism is carbon absorption, which works, incredibly well for chlorinated solvents. Carbon's like a sponge; it soaks up organic contaminants very easily. But because it has that impregnated iron component, essentially zero valent iron, you get chemical reduction taking place. And when the chlorinated ethylenes, in this case, get destroyed, they desorb off the carbon. They're innocuous at that point. And it frees up those adsorption sites to absorb more solvents. So if something desorbs off the soil, there's adsorption capacity remaining on that product. So in essence, it regenerates that carbon in situ by continually destroying the absorbed solvents and freeing up those adsorption sites for more contaminants.
Thank you, Kevin. Second question, or I guess third, technically, is it's pertaining to the vapor intrusion concerns and how those were evaluated, I guess, before and after remediation.
Yeah, so again, so I'm not a risk assessor. I'll qualify that right off the bat, but my understanding is in BC and probably most other jurisdictions, there's different ways to monitor indoor air quality, and some are based on actual measurements, some are based on subslab vapor measurements, and some are based on modeled vapor migration pathways. So on this site, the worst case area had no building on top of it, so that wasn't an issue. The concerns were for the residences and the adjacent portions of the building. And my understanding was it was based more on lateral vapor transport and infiltration or intrusion into the buildings. So once we had treated the on-site soil and groundwater concentrations below a certain level, those modeled vapor concentrations fell below triggers where they would have to continue monitoring.
Excellent, thank you. Next question, any evidence of biodegradation as a component?
Yeah, another good question. So I'll infer what the question is. There has been clearly some biodegradation taking place at the site because there were degradation products present. There was TC, there was Cis1,2, DC, there was vinyl chloride. So there had been some natural reductive dehalogenation taking place at the site. But the treatment mechanism that we employed there is primarily abiotic. So it doesn't form those toxic daughter products or those degradation products that you would see, for example, if you just had reductive dehalogenation taking place.
Yeah, just to add on to that real quick. So the sister technology to BOSS 100, which is called CAT 100, does include a biological component. So that does have an electron donor and bacteria added to it. But this, as Kevin has mentioned, this particular application did not involve electron donor addition or any bacteria. And I don't,
That's right.
and I don't any of that. I guess I don't know. I'd ask that question to you. If any of the sort of biological markers were monitored as part of the monitoring program for this site.
No, not outside of just the standard suite of volatiles, right? Like there weren't any of the other like chloroacetylenes or anything like that monitored. It was really just the scheduled contaminants that they were looking for.
Okay. Another question is passivation of the iron an issue, at which point desorption may be a concern?
Again, that's a good question. Mike, you might want to chime in at the end of this, but I would say I don't think so. And the reason I say that is because it's not, the product is not like a mixture of zero valent iron and activated carbon as separate particles. The carbon is actually impregnated with the iron. So you don't have like a a particle of iron sitting there. And the designs that we use on these sites, and this one in particular, we designed the loading rate for the property based on a few different factors. One was what the total amount of activated carbon is necessary to fully absorb the mass of chlorinated solvents in the subsurface. What's the total amount of iron necessary to facilitate that destruction of the chlorinated solvents? And then there's another calculation that we do, which is related to a distribution density to ensure contact. So we do all those calculations, and whatever is the most critical one drives the design. So it's not like there is not enough iron there that, or it's a particle that's going to become passivated that will then become less effective. Mike, do you want to add to that at all?
Sure. I mean, you touched on most of it. I mean, because the iron is impregnated within the carbon, you don't have the same sort of passivation type issues that you do with traditional zero valent iron reacting with things like, say, sulfate in the groundwater. And secondly, as Kevin mentioned, as part of the design process, we're basing it on making sure we have enough iron within the subsurface to deal with the mass that's present, and that's mass in the groundwater, but also there's a piece that we account for from the adsorbed component, the adsorbed phase, as well as what can continue to back diffuse and feed that groundwater over time.
Right.
Okay, if there are any other questions, we'll probably start wrapping up here. But go ahead and put those in there. And if you do, Kevin's information is listed right there. As part of the invite, you got Dr. Ed Winter, his information as well. So you can feel free to reach out to one of those two individuals. But I don't see any more questions coming in. So Kevin, thank you very much for the presentation. It was great. And thank you to everyone that has joined us today. Again, please reach out if you'd like a copy of the recording, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody.